The days of the week, a potpourri of planets and a gathering of gods. Let's talk about the days of the week, shall we? It's oftentimes the big things that we tend to overlook and to take for granted. So what I want to talk about today is easily retrievable from the web. You might want to start out, for example, by exploring the concept of planetary hours on Wikipedia and piecing together the underlying history. However, it's badly not common knowledge at all. Therefore, talking about the naming conventions of the days of the week may be a worthwhile endeavor. Now, perhaps we may ask ourselves why indeed the days of the week are called the way they are. So what exactly is a Tues? What's a Wednes? What's a Thurs, Fry with an I, and so on? Well, yes, we do see the sun in Sunday, but what's the reason for and meaning of all that? Planets. What, you might ask, and rightly so, because what on earth has Tues and Wednes and Thurs and all of the other stuff got to do with planets? Well, yes, it's planets. What exactly do I have in mind by saying that, and how exactly are planets involved in the naming of the days of the week? First things first, we really have to state that what we're talking about here aren't exactly the 8 modern planets as we know them from modern astronomy. What we call planets today is a very modern notion. There used to be 9, by the way, but as we all know, Pluto was demoted. That didn't happen because of malignancy, because somebody didn't like Pluto, so it had to be demoted. No, the reason was quite simply that we discovered multiple objects in Pluto's neighborhood, quite resembling Pluto in properties and size. Which is, by the way, exactly what happened to a number of objects orbiting the Sun between Mars and Jupiter more than 100 years ago. Ceres, Vesta, Juno, Pallas, and thousands more aren't considered planets, even though Ceres, for example, is in our direct neighborhood, is completely round and just a little bit smaller than Pluto. But I digress. What we're talking about here are planets in the original sense of the word. Planet is a Greek word, planetes, or if you want to pronounce it in a more Byzantine or modern Greek way, it'd be planitis, and that quite simply means wanderer. So why are the planets called wanderers? Well, there used to be something people of old did on a regular basis, which we do not do that often because we have the internet, and that was observing the night sky night after night. The apparent dome of the sky will revolve around us every night, and the stars we see will also vastly differ by season. But overall, the relative constellations of stars visible to the naked eye will seem fixed, albeit ever revolving, for all practical intents and purposes. Apart, however, from 7 wandering bodies that do move quite noticeably when compared against the aforementioned backdrop of the fixed constellations, these are the 7 wanderers, the 7 original planets, well discernible by the naked eye. These celestial 7 are Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury. 5 actual planets, as we'd still name them today, as well as the 2 big lights, the Sun and the Moon. The Sun is, of course, not a planet in the modern sense of the word, and neither is the Moon, but they are planets, i.e. wanderers, inasmuch as they are moving bodies against the backdrop of constellations of fixed stars. Hence, I've set them a little bit apart in the group of the 7 planets as understood by antiquity. And for the purposes of this video, I'll henceforth call these planets, these 7, i.e. the 7 wanderers of old, visible to the naked eye and not the modern ones. Let's set ourselves a very obvious example of the relative movement of planets. The Moon might appear to inhabit the constellation of Aries today, but tomorrow it will already be in Taurus. The day after tomorrow it will have moved even further to the left, and so on and so forth. So in fact, the Moon moves about half a zodiacal constellation per night, and all in all it will take the Moon about 27.3 days to get exactly around the apparent dome of stars. This is the so-called sidereal month, i.e. the duration of the Moon wandering across the sky exactly once. That month is, by the way, about 2 days shorter than the cycle of lunar phases, full moon to full moon, the so-called synodic month. The reason for that difference is an interesting question with an interesting answer in its own right, but for today it shall suffice to say that there are about 27.5 days that the Moon needs to cover the sky. Those are thus the 27 Indian nakshatrani, as well as the 28 Chinese lunar mansions called Shou. You'll notice that there's a discrepancy between the Indian 27 and the Chinese 28 because reality is, of course, right in between those two. However, humanity tends to favor whole integers. That's a digression, but worth mentioning in any case. Now, we can group the planets by orbital periods, so you get a picture such as this, with Saturn taking about 30 years to cross the entire sky, Jupiter about 12 years to make a full 360, Mars about 2 years, the Sun, of course, 1 year, the very definition of the terrestrial year. Venus and Mercury are a little bit more complicated because their orbits are far from being exactly circular when viewed from the Earth. Even less circular than the other ones because the other planetary orbits are also not entirely circular. They have so-called epicycles. That's a term from earlier astronomy where we had to assume sort of cycles within cycles to account for the fact that sometimes planets tend to express retrograde motion, but that's another topic entirely. For the time being, we can just state that there are specific mean orbital periods, and the depicted sequence of planets would be the best one to order them by said orbital period. Starting with Saturn being the one taking the longest and ending with the Moon with the shortest orbital period of just about a month. Okay, so now that we have this specific sequence of planets, how does that translate into the sequence of the days of the week? How do the planets correspond to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday? With a little bit of fantasy, one might identify at least 3 of those planets. Monday is essentially Moon Day. Saturday is the day of Saturn, and Sunday quite obviously being the day of the Sun. But what about the rest? The 4 other names of the days of the week do not really seem to be reflective of the planets we identified earlier on. Well, for that purpose, we'll have to talk about Germanic gods first. Why on earth, or why by all the gods, you may ask, would we have to talk about Germanic gods when talking about planets, or indeed the names of the days of the week? But that is indeed exactly what we'll have to do, talk about Germanic gods. English is a Germanic language, albeit adulterated by gargantuan amounts of medieval French, and you may like it or not, but the early English, or rather the Anglo-Saxons, venerated Germanic gods before the advent of Christianity. When they lost the gods themselves, they did, however, keep their names, at least in the names of the days of the week. So what they did in the first place was essentially translating the names of the Roman gods that already inhabited that very spot and had been used for the days of the week by the Romans. The Anglo-Saxons, as most other European peoples, especially with the advent of Christianity, adopted Roman norms, Roman law, Roman astronomy, Roman traditions, etc. And one of those was exactly the tradition of naming the days of the week. Now compare this to the Italian names. Italian sprang of Vulgar Latin. Latin is actually spoken in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. So we get lunedì, martedì, mercoledì, giovedì, venerdì, sabato, domenica. These reflect Luna, Italian for moon, in Monday, Mars in Tuesday, Mercoledì is nothing other but Mercury and Wednesday, Giovedì is all about Jupiter, and Venerdì is Venus. The 5 working days, if you will. Whilst Sabato and Domenica are different. They sprang from the name of the Sabbath and the day of the Lord, respectively. But let's have a look at the Germanic analogues. On the left, we see the reconstructed Proto-Germanic forms that then yielded different outcomes in different Germanic daughter languages. In Old Norse, for example, we have Tyr, Odin, Thor, or Thor with a voiceless r in modern Icelandic, whose pronunciation differs markedly from Old Norse, and Frigg. By the way, meanings change over time, just like pronunciation. Tivas, Tyr, or Tiu, was originally the god, cognate with the Latin Deus, the Greek Zeus, as well as Diaus in Sanskrit. The god of the sunlit sky, but changed into the Germanic god of warfare. Norse Odin, Woden in Old English, Wotan in Old High German, was literally the furious one, but changed into a seer god or divine messenger. Thor is thunder and hence the god of thunder, and Frigg is a peculiar female deity with connotations of freedom, but she's close enough to being a goddess of love, hence she was equated with Venus. I'll use the Old Norse forms as reflected in popular English literature as convenient placeholders. They're by far the most well-known to modern readers. And so we get the following picture of equations as devised by Germanic peoples. 4 Germanic gods, corresponding more or less directly to the Roman gods featured in the names of the days of the week. Consequently, what we get is Monday, i.e. essentially Moon Day. Tuesday to Friday are named after the aforementioned gods. Saturday is Saturn's Day, retaining the name of the Roman god of harvest, since there was no direct analogue in Germanic mythology. While Sunday is quite overtly Sun Day. But why exactly this peculiar sequence? Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, and the Sun. Because remember, we had a very different sequence by orbital period. Starting with Saturn, the outermost planet still visible to the naked eye, followed by Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. However, as we just saw a few slides ago, the sequence of the gods was Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, and the Sun. Now, juxtaposing those two sequences does not entirely compute. We can immediately see that they're quite different to each other. How can we therefore explain these discrepancies? Another historical intermezzo comes into play here that might be baffling at first sight. It's Babylon. Just as we saw somewhat earlier that Germanic gods started to interfere, and we couldn't really understand why at first. So let's tackle the part of history that ties back to Babylon. So yes, Babylon. As a matter of fact, quite a few things that we take for granted harken back to Babylon. We divide our angles into 360 degrees, our hours into 60 minutes, our days into 24 hours. All that is Babylonian. And the Babylonians were also the ones who created the astronomical system inherited by the Greeks, then the Romans, and eventually the Anglo-Saxons. Planets, the deities corresponding to them, the zodiac, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and all the rest of that family, they're of Babylonian origin. All the aforementioned middlemen contributed, added, and modified, but the Babylonian origins still shine through. Actually, the Babylonians in turn inherited that system from the Sumerians, but let's not be picky. Now, the key to reconciling the sequence by orbital period with the sequence that we can observe in the naming of the days of the week is the concept of the so-called planetary hours. Highly recommended for research on the internet if you want to explore this concept even further. Now, how does it work? Let's start out on the first hour of Saturday, the Sabbath, and assign every upcoming hour the subsequent planet in the orbital series. So the first hour of Saturday is governed by Saturn, the second one by Jupiter, then Mars, and so on and so forth. Continuing in that vein will lead to assigning Saturn to the 8th hour. So we just run through the sequence of planets in a cyclical way. Jupiter will thus govern the 2nd as well as the 9th hour, Mars the 3rd and the 10th, and so on. Running through all 24 hours of Saturday leads to the following picture then, and will simply continue, which means that the Sun will rule the first hour of the second day, Sunday. Remember, we started on Saturday. Just like this. All that means that we just moved by 3 planets when advancing by 1 day, i.e. 24 hours. Now, we can couch this in somewhat more mathematical terms because mathematically speaking, 24 is equivalent to 3 modulo 7. That quite simply means that 24 will leave a rest of 3 when divided by 7. Or indeed that 24 is the same as 3 when moving through a cycle of 7 planets in this case. Just like 13 o'clock is 1 p.m. on a clock of 12 hours. Well, 24 a planet o'clock is thus equivalent to 3 a planet o'clock on a clock, quote unquote, of 7 planets. The sequence of planets ruling the very first hour of each day, and thus by extension the entirety of the respective day, would thus be the following. Saturn ruling Saturday, remember we started on Saturday, the Sabbath. Sun ruling Sunday, and Monday ruled by the moon. Now we just keep cycling through the sequence of planets by moving 3 planets around the planetary clock, and that gives us the sequence highlighted here, which is exactly the sequence we were after. Let's have a look at the full picture again. We get a systematic sequence of planets ruling the first hour of any given day of the week. These are precisely the aforementioned planetary hours and the astronomical reason for naming the days of the week. Because let's remember the equations between Germanic gods and Roman gods, i.e. the Germanic names of the planets and the Roman names of the planets. We don't have to go into the Babylonian or Greek names, although those were of course their predecessors. Another way of visualizing the system is by positioning the names of the planets clockwise by orbital period along a circle. But when drawing a star, skipping 3 planets ahead with each of its rays, and then simply following the star, we get exactly the sequence of the names of the week. So again, just to put it very bluntly, we have to start with Saturn on Saturday, otherwise the sequence doesn't work. We have to start out on the first hour of the Sabbath. So the week, an integral and indispensable part of our everyday lives that we all take for granted, houses quite a bit of history. Sumerian beginnings, Babylonian elaboration and all that, Aramean and Hebrew traditions, heavily infused by everything Babylonian, Christianity springing from it, couched into Greek and Roman terms later, inherited by the Germanic peoples that were the cultural successors to Rome throughout Western Europe, and ultimately adopted by the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, who shaped England and the Anglosphere as we know it. Now, the planetary sequence quite evidently betrays its Middle Eastern origins, because as we saw early on, we have to start out with Saturn on the Sabbath, otherwise the sequence does not work. Interestingly enough, the Jews themselves usually do not use the planetary order. The days are quite simply numbered in Hebrew. Sabbath is the Sabbath, and Sunday is then considered and called the first day after the Sabbath. Monday the 2nd, Tuesday the 3rd, and so on. Traditions can change. Delving even deeper into things hidden in plain sight, the Sabbath isn't an originally Jewish concept. The Akkadian Babylonian word Shabbatum or Shabbatum denotes what the Romans called the Ides. Remember, Caesar was killed on the Ides of March, i.e. mid-March. In Babylon, this was specifically the mid-month full moon, and hence the beginning of any month's latter half, only later transformed into the first day of the Hebrew week. So what we conducted here was a quick ride from Babylon through Rome to Germania and back again in 7 days. And that will be that. Thank you so much for tuning in.